Good afternoon. Thank you everyone for coming. I'd like to welcome Professor Naomi Mezey from Georgetown University Law Center, where she's been a professor since 1998. Her work focuses on law and humanities, law and popular culture, jurisprudence, and in particular law and visual culture, which is what she'll be addressing today. She also is one of the people who runs the Law and Humanities Junior Scholars Conference, which I participated in several years ago, among many other things. And today she'll be talking about optics, death, and desire in the law. So welcome.
Thank you. So nice, I get applause before I even say you all are polite. Okay, so I first just want to say thank you for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here. I've never spent any time in Kentucky, and it was. I think I'm going to make Brian take me to the races this time. So, thinking about the invitation, and particularly thinking about the fact that Brian invited me, I decided that I wanted to write something about visuality because Brian was my research assistant, actually, when I wrote my very first article about film, and he taught me an awful lot about film in that short few months, and taught me most of what I know about John Ford. So that's why the topic, and I also just wanted an occasion to start thinking about these videos of police shootings of black men, sort of think through them a little bit. And one thing that I've done, I just want to sort of issue the warning that some of the images are disturbing, and I was having a bit of a dilemma trying to decide what and how much to show you. I didn't want to impose on you. For those of you who had chosen not to watch some of these videos, I didn't want to make you watch them. And what I've ended up doing is mostly just using stills. So there are stills of dead bodies. And when I use a video, I'm not showing the actual shooting in the video. So if any of that sounds distressing to you, let me know, and I can let you know when the images are coming up. But that was sort of my compromise, and I hope it works okay for you. So the last 25 years, I would say, at least in the humanities, there has been a turn to the visual and the growth of the study of visual culture. And the turn has taken longer, I think, in law, but it has come nonetheless. But it's mainly come to legal scholarship. It has not made, and it's in some ways come to legal practice. That is, there's a huge amount of visuality in courts. But the reading of images has not so much had an impact yet on courts, juries, and the public. And we've, at the same time that we've never lived so fully enveloped in visuality, we are still mostly unschooled at how to read our environment, our visual environment, or how to absorb the techniques of reading that the visual, I think, invites and requires. And I've been mildly obsessed for the last few years with thinking about the role of the law in the space between reality and representation, and the way the law helps represent reality, and not just visually, but in judicial opinions and statutes and legislative history and agency reports. It represents reality, frames and represents reality to us. This is textually and rhetorically, but nonetheless representational. And it's only more recently that I started thinking more about, not just about the representation, but about viewing and spectatorship. And what does it mean to consume events visually as spectators rather than participants? And how does what we see change us, remake our own perception? And my starting point is that visuality is itself a language, and that it works like language. So James Boyd White very famously said, language does not so much shape who we are. Language does much to shape who we are, our very selves, and the way in which we observe and construe the world. And so this is really my beginning thoughts on thinking about the relationship between death and visual spectacle in light of what has become a very tragically common genre of the video of black men being killed by police. And one of the interesting things about these videos is that they're fragments. Wendy Lesser has a book called Pictures at an Execution, and she calls representations of killings murder stories. And these are fragments of murder stories. One of the reasons that we are drawn to them and consume them and can't help but watch them when we do watch them is because they narrate, and we want to see how the story goes. But these are narrative fragments, and they don't tell the whole story. They're excerpts in a sense, and they're fragments of a lot of different kinds of narratives: historical, racial, literary, legal. As fragments of legal narratives in particular, they invoke law in a whole lot of different ways. And I'm not going to talk about all of the ways, but I want to just sort of lay out, I think, as police enforcement, as wrongful death, as crime, as evidence, as facts and rules, as products and producers of racial knowledge. And in a way, the sort of law as the always too late arbiter of injury. So this visual genre has grown out of the many, many videos that have surfaced of police violence against either unarmed or relatively harmless black men and boys. So in the last year alone, 6 instances have been particularly prominent, and these are just the ones I'm going to touch on. It is... Sorry. It went to sleep, I think.
Oh, it's doing that damn shutdown thing.
Oh, that's not good. Sorry. All right, I'm going to keep talking while
Maybe I can ask you a question that will
Yeah.
give it a chance to breathe. Are there similar videos of killings of other categories of people, or is it just a coincidence? I mean, it's more than a coincidence at this point that there is a particular focus of the images on the images of black men. And the reason I'm asking that is because if there are other films of killings being taken and we're not seeing them as much, that would suggest there's a sort of larger meta-narrative going on in which people who present things to the public or publicize things have selected a group of things to show us that have now become a type of genre that wouldn't be a genre if we hadn't been shown this genre specifically, right? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, of
And
course.
it's really kind of an empirical question. I just don't know whether there's other stuff out there.
So I don't know that I can give you an empirical answer, but certainly the creation of a genre is itself a framing question, right? What things are you going to extract from the world around you as being like each other that they themselves create a genre? And I think that certainly there are other videos out there of both other people killing and other people being killed, right? Not just black men, and not just police doing the killing. But part of, in some ways, it's for, thanks Brian. I'm sorry, I'm really bad at multitasking, especially when one of the tasks involves the computer. So I would say it's less important to me what the empirical answer is to that question, more that even if this is and I think it is, it's a sub-genre maybe, right, of a large, but it is a sub-genre, and that it has had cultural salience at this moment, and that's actually sort of, I want to think about that question, right? Why is this as culturally salient as it is right now, and how does that relate to the videos and how we read the videos. And so I don't know the empirical part of it, and it's a really good question. Good, we're almost back. Thank you. No, it's okay, it just stalled out. So, I'll start with the 6 examples. And these are all within the last year. So it's not crazy to think that this is, there are reasons why they have been prominent. So in March, I'm gonna tell them in chronological order, but this is not the way in which they became publicized. I think in some ways Michael Brown, the one instance where there was not a video of the actual killing, spurred the release of the other videos, even of things that came before. Okay, so a year ago, in March of 2014, James Boyd, shown here, was killed by Albuquerque police officers after a standoff between police and the mentally ill homeless man when he was camped illegally in the hills above Albuquerque. Boyd had 2 small camping knives, but was shot in the back. And the video of the shooting was taken from a camera mounted on the helmet of one of the officers. So you can see that we're seeing down the rifle, basically, of the officer wearing the helmet. And then in July of 2014, Eric Garner was approached in Staten Island by 2 New York City police officers for illegally selling loose cigarettes. Garner had been arrested multiple times for exactly the same offense, and he was complaining to the officers that he was tired of being harassed and had done nothing wrong, and died of a chokehold used by one of the officers. His death was filmed by a bystander in this instance. In August, so the next month, in August of 2014, John Crawford picked up an unpackaged BB air rifle in a Walmart near Dayton, Ohio, carried it around the store as he looked at other merchandise. Officers were told that there was a man in the Walmart with a gun, and they killed Crawford moments after entering. This is a security camera shot, so security cameras showed some, but not all of what happened. A few days later, literally like 3 or 4 days later, August of 2014, Michael Brown was stopped for walking down the middle of the road in Ferguson, Missouri. Police officer Darren Wilson had reason to believe that he had just robbed a convenience store. There is a video of that. And after an altercation with Wilson, the unarmed Brown fled, turned back around, and was then shot and killed by Wilson. In November of last year, 12-year-old Tamir West was killed by police officers in Cleveland after pointing a toy gun at people in a park. A 911 caller alerted the police but told the operator that the gun was probably a fake. Tamir was killed within seconds of the officers arriving, and that video came from a nearby surveillance camera. I think it's across the street, and this is a close-up of Tamir. And then just 2 weeks ago, on April 4th, Walter Scott was killed by a police officer in North Charleston. After being stopped for a broken taillight, Walter Scott fled, and he was shot while running away from the officer, and his death was captured by a bystander. So what do we make of these scenes, and what domain of meaning do we view them? The meanings generated by images, I think, can serve as factual premises in legal disputes. They can serve as evidence of contested facts in court. And in both of these senses, they're legal facts. Or these scenes might be more comprehensible, or at least as comprehensible as factual premises or evidence of other kinds of meaning, such as cultural or political meaning about race and policing. Or they might not register actually as fact at all, or not as much as fact as affect, maybe, speaking to us about body, pain, and the limits of representation. And it's in this latter sense that the videos are not legal facts, but cultural artifacts. And while there is much to be said about the videos as legal facts, I want to talk about them also as cultural artifacts, as sites of affective engagement with death, spectacle, desire, and a source of reflection on racial inequality and ethical violence. So as legal facts, I'm going to sort of talk a little bit about legal facts, videos as legal facts, and then as cultural artifacts. As legal facts, I think these documentary videos, and I'm calling them documentary videos because they are meant to simply document what happened, not consciously created in a narrative vein, although they are certainly narratives. They show us what happened, right? In this sense, they partake of what the theorist Martin Jay calls scopic regimes of modernity, in which visuality is allied with science and technologies of certainty, so that we use visuality to understand truth. We get knowledge, we understand truth from images that are derived from certain kinds of instruments of sight, telescopes, microscopes, cameras. So this assumption at least it comes with an assumption of legibility. And this is evident in the debate about whether police should be wearing body cameras. We think that those cameras can actually solve the problems of uncertainty, of not knowing what happened. These images, commentators, at least about the body cameras, assume can show us what happened in a way that is more reliable than witnesses or other kinds of witnesses other than the camera, I should say. I have written elsewhere about why images cannot speak for themselves, even though the Supreme Court famously said that they can, when it relied on a video taken from a police cruiser in Scott versus Harris. And in that case, 8 justices found that the videotape of a car chase was an unmediated window into the reality of what actually happened. They felt that it allowed them to, and they said, view the events with their own eyes. And this conviction that undoctored documentary videotapes are not actually subject to alternative interpretations because they transport the viewer to the scene collapses the basic distinction between reality and representation that has been foundational in Western thought for the last 400 years. So the problem of assumed legibility, right, that we can look at a documentary video and know what we are seeing, is one of the things that I am arguing against when we use these videos as legal facts. But the other problem, the problem I think in some ways is greater than whether they're legible, whether we can actually make them out, is that for the documentaries to function as legal facts requires that they do more than just provide a whole lot of information. They actually have to be able to answer the legally relevant, disputed questions posed in the case. So again, I think Scott versus Harris suggests why courts struggle with this. The videos provide so many underlying facts that courts often assume that the video images can resolve contested material facts before them. So at issue in Scott was whether the car chase posed such a threat to the public that the police officers' actions were objectively reasonable. And if they were, they didn't constitute excessive force. Now, the video showed many, many things, and it was potentially probative on many issues involving the chase. But one of the things that, at least to my eyes, it did not show very clearly was how dangerous the chase was to other people. But because the court determined that the images spoke for themselves, it was relatively easy to conclude for the justices that the video showed them precisely what they were looking for. That is, what the case framed up as the relevant question. So, visual interpretation of these videos as legal facts means, at a minimum, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah.
Sure,
Is
go
it
for
okay
it.
if I interrupt?
I'm happy to be interrupted.
Well, are they saying then that it's turned, the determination of what reasonable force was or reasonable reaction is now not for the jury because the judges themselves can see exactly what happened and make their own judgment? Huh.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting case, partly because it is a summary judgment case. So the question was, are these images that even get to a jury, right? Could a reasonable jury find? And they say, well, we have the video.
Yeah.
We don't need a jury. We have the video. Yeah. So, it is actually that question that makes that case especially interesting. Visual interpretation, I think, or at least what I want to argue, when it operates as a legal fact, requires thinking about a whole lot of things that the court doesn't even begin to think about in Scott versus Harris, and now more recent cases where they've used videos, which is accounting for the medium itself, thinking about the viewing context, and the viewer. And in each of these aspects, there are alternative perspectives that one might have. So accounting for the medium means considering the camera's own way of seeing and narrating. So even just considering the position of the camera, the angle of the shot, how the shot is framed, audio, whether there's audio at all. All of these things can really illuminate or obscure, actually, but influence the way we read images. And I'm not positive that I was going to show you a piece of the Tamir Rice video, partly because, I'll see if I can just call it up quickly, partly because it's such an interesting contrast to the all of the other videos. They're understandable. Okay, so I just wanted to give you a sense of what that looked like. Yeah.
How easy is it to know visually, like if you know something about guns or whatever, is it easy to determine whether something's a pellet gun versus like a
No,
real weapon or that thing in the Walmart? No, I mean even for people who spend time looking at these things, it's not obvious.
I mean, this was a toy gun that was meant to look very much like a real gun. It looked like a real gun.
My relatives used to shoot rabbits with a pellet gun, so it is not a toy. Not in quite the same sense as even a BB gun.
Okay. So partly, one of the reasons I want to show you the image and the image moving is that the assessing what the meaning of the video is means taking account in some ways of how you're watching it, what the camera is showing you, what it frames. Here it is black and white, it's grainy, there's no audio. The silence and the fact that it's shot from above make it actually feel kind of ominous and foreboding, partly because we also know how it ends, but there is something about, also the fact that it's shot from above makes Tamir Rice look even more small and childlike. And that turned out to be one of the contested facts, was how big he was, whether he looked like a child at all, whether he was threatening, and that the notion of the threat is always part of these cases, yeah.
It's a little embarrassing that I don't know the answer to this, but, because I'm not a big sports fan, but hasn't there been, you know, a decision with respect to refs in sporting events and whether or not they can rely on videos? And what is that? And do you consider that at all?
I think it varies with the sport. So some sports, they do allow for video, like for the referees to view the video replay, and in other sports they don't.
Do you consider that at all?
I don't in that, I mean, I haven't, I think it's a related question, and I haven't thought about it, but it certainly raises some, there's slightly different kinds of narratives, but I would imagine that you'd have to think about the same kinds of questions. That is, what are you seeing, right? And what are you not seeing? How is the image framed? And I think that those are some of the debates that go on around the reliability of sports replays too, yeah.
I was wondering if part of the problem with videos is that you can't really cross-examine them. And somebody could come in and authenticate this and say, yeah, I was standing there and I shot this. But they can't really speak to the visual implications of what they're shooting. They can't speak to the way it distorts the height or the whatever of the person they're shooting. And ideally, you'd like to think that it would be at least in part the role of some attorney, defense, or whatever side he's on, to come in and ask these questions, right? To point out to the judge, look at the issue that we can't really resolve here, and look at this angle and so on.
So a scholar of law and film, Jessica Silby, has actually written a piece called Cross-Examining Film or something like that. And it's about the, at least in trial practice, of doing just that, of trying to get a certain amount of just understanding videos well enough and understanding cameras well enough to be able to, and in a way, that's kind of what happened with Rodney King, right? There was a cross-examination of the video. Now, when both sides are cross-examining, it gets really complicated.
Do you bring in experts to talk about some of that, or?
I would imagine you might want to, right?
Yeah, I would certainly want to. I'm just wondering what they actually, did they get away with that? I don't want to call
so
an expert to talk about this video.
I think this is, so this is part of a larger question about how, what's our visual literacy? And if we assume, so one version is the Supreme Court's, which is we're all equally visually literate and we start that way, and the mediation of the camera doesn't do that much and we can see what happened, and you don't need experts, right? You don't even need analysis. Another version is we have sight, but we don't have visual literacy, and we do need experts to help us think through what it is we're seeing and why they look a particular way, why we tell ourselves a story about what we're seeing that may or may not be right. And then I think another version is, at some point we all have a certain amount of visual literacy from which we can do that without experts, but I don't really know where we are. I think we're sort of at the beginning of that possible trajectory of literacy. So, and just as a contrast, actually, I will show you these are really quite different. Okay, so this video in contrast is so much partly it's in color, partly because you're seeing it sort of down the scope of the police rifle, has the quality of almost like a first-person shooter video game, right? It has that, I mean, it's not clear. This is also fairly blurry, but the camera puts the viewer in the position of the officer and gives the viewer the impression of holding the rifle, and makes the observer more likely to view the action from that perspective. So these are just like really basic ways in which we might interrogate the way the medium itself and the shots of what we're seeing create certain kinds of meanings. And then second, what the videos convey, how they make us feel, how we might make sense of them, I think is also influenced by the environment in which we're viewing them. Whether we're clicking on a link in a New York Times article, whether we're in a courtroom, whether we're on a phone at a bus stop on a public street or in a law school workshop. They read differently in different contexts, and they're processed differently depending on the viewer himself, herself. And again, this is the difference of perception that's created by different experiences and social conditions. Dan Kahan's work on cognition and the Scott versus Harris case is really interesting in that way. He basically does a study of different ways people view that dash cam video. So these videos almost certainly register in very different ways for different viewers, certainly for Black and white viewers, for wealthy and poor viewers, for those who have police officers in their family, or those who have had frightening encounters with the police. And I think even differently for those people who are sort of more inclined to watch, no matter how disturbing, and those who don't feel that it's right to watch, that they react differently. Yeah.
That Supreme Court case, wouldn't that suggest doubts about allowing in expert evidence about how sort of how you perceive the video, you know what, how it's the way it was made would impact your understanding of it? I mean, because it's that just seems like such an interesting case that they're sort of saying we don't need someone to mediate the facts because they're available to us directly.
Right.
And it seems like under that rationale, you wouldn't allow all this stuff in.
Exactly.
Because then you'd end up having debates about what the facts actually were, all that stuff.
My understanding of the rules of evidence governing motion picture evidence are that you could, in fact, have experts testifying on questions of, material questions of fact about what could be established and what couldn't.
But that does seem inconsistent with what the Supreme Court said, right?
Well, so there are questions that happen at two different points in the litigation. The Supreme Court says you don't have expert witnesses because you don't even get to a jury, right? If you have unmediated visual evidence, judge can decide. It's not, and they would know what happened. It wouldn't. So I think the question is if you had some question about what you were seeing, then it might go to a jury, and then it would make more sense to have expert witnesses. So I want to just sort of switch gears ever so slightly, and I have no way of sensing whether I'm talking too long because we're. So will you just tell me when to stop, right? Okay. So I want to sort of switch to thinking about these videos as cultural artifacts, not just legal facts, and thinking about how the images, the videos themselves and the images in them have sort of started to circulate, and what they inspire in us, which I think is a whole range of reactions, some emotional and affective and others not. And I think in some ways the cultural artifact comes before the legal fact. That is, before we even have a case, we have to understand whether certain kinds of pain or inequity are even an injury, and when injuries are recognizable as injustices, right? All of that comes first. And So it's important to think about how they register as artifacts. And I actually think these videos are interesting precisely because they've helped transform injuries and outrages that were well known in Black communities into an injustice that's more broadly recognizable. And in that sense, culturally, more than legally, they are sources of reflection on racial inequality. But first I want to sort of acknowledge why they're really complex as sites of affective engagement with death, spectacle, desire. Okay, so as spectacle, the videos of these videos partake in at least a couple of different genealogies of death as spectacle. And one is the legal executions of condemned in public squares in Europe and early United States. And the other is the long history of extra-legal lynchings. And I think in the interest of time, we'll just talk really quickly about the first one, the public execution. Michel Foucault, very, very famous account of public executions and Discipline and Punish, and one of the reasons I think it's relevant here is because these are police shootings, right? They're in some sense, even if they are later found to be illegal, they start as acts by the state. And he says these kinds of, the public execution is not so much about justice or even example, but displays of asymmetrical and superior sovereign power. And this is a quote, "This superiority is not simply that of right, but of the physical strength of the sovereign beating down upon the body of his adversary and mastering it. The ceremony of punishment is an exercise of power." And so I'm not, just to be clear here, I don't want to, in this parallel, suggest that the victims of the police killings are themselves guilty and ought to be condemned. If they're guilty, they're not remotely guilty of anything that would merit execution, but that the events and the circulation of the videos are a kind of manifestation of state power and mastery, as well as an invitation for us to observe them as spectacles. So, and in fact, I think in some ways the relative innocence of the victims makes the images even more discernible as displays of power. And it's interesting that the viewers are part of this ritual. This is again Foucault. In the ceremonies of the public execution, the main character was the people whose real and immediate presence was required for the performance. And in the circulation of these video images of the killings, I think the presence of the observer, even when it's not physical, is nonetheless real and participatory. And then that genealogy continues, and Wendy Lesser accounts for one part of that genealogy, and I'll just mention two bits of it. She's trying to draw the link between murder and theater, between death imposed on a human being and dramatic spectacle. And one piece of this, she says, is how the medium mediates between the reader or the viewer and the killing. And she mentions the first and only photograph of an American execution by electric chair that was published in a newspaper. This was in the New York Daily News in 1928. The paper's photographer was sent to cover the execution of Ruth Snyder at Sing Sing, and he strapped a camera to his ankle. It was hidden under his baggy trousers, and he took this picture. The reason why it's shot sort of slightly from below is it was taken from his ankle, and I'm not sure how he did that. And this caused a huge stir at the time that it was published, and partly because it's you don't know exactly what's going on here, or you can't see what's going on here. I think that's the difference, right? You can't see what's going on here, but partly it's the knowledge that it is the moment of electrocution that makes it horrifying and why people were horrified by it. Wendy Lesser also highlights Ouija's photographs, and Ouija, mid-century photographer who had a book, a 1945 book on photographs of New York, one whole section of which was murder photographs. And for Ouija, the murder, especially murder in New York, was about spectatorship. And so I've given you one image here, which is, it's called Balcony Seats in a Murder, in which the photograph is about the spectatorship. Most of the photograph is the people viewing the murder. You can barely see the body. And in fact, there's a couple of other photographs in the same collection of Ouija's that there is no body, it's just the observers, the faces and reactions of the spectators.
Is this a crime scene by now, or is there is a guy standing over him the actual murderer?
No, it's a crime scene.
It's a crime scene, okay.
Yeah. So Ouija actually always, gets there right after. He clearly had some contacts, right? He gets there right afterwards.
Police scanner that he used.
Does he have a police scanner? Okay.
Good with the murderer community.
But he did say they all wear suits and have these gray felt hats, and if I just followed a guy on a New York City street wearing a gray felt hat, eventually I would be there right when it happened. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about, less about spectacle and desire. So in addition to placing videos of police killings in this visual genealogy, I want to think about how they draw us in, why we watch them, and try to account a little bit for the really complex desire I think they invite. So what we see, vision is not just, biological, it is social, it's historical, and what we see and how we see it is clearly influenced by history, by images we've previously seen, by what we know and imagine about the world, by what our normative presuppositions, all of these things that I think constitute desire in some sense. And in the visual narrative fragments of these videos, there's a desire for still more narrative, partly because they're fragmentary and partly because they complicate our apprehension of what we're seeing. And in Martin Jay's writings about the scopic regime, he talks about a kind of pre-modern concern of St. Augustine's with ocular desire, and that was the quote I had at the beginning. And for St. Augustine, the lust of the eyes for pleasure and knowledge was a dangerous thing. And ocular desire, in this interesting way, captures something compelling about these videos that's not just like sadistic pleasure or lurid fascination. St. Augustine explains ocular desire as the seduction of the eyes to beauty and pleasure, but also, and I think he thinks more dangerously, to knowledge and learning. The experiments with flesh to know it rather than just to delight in it. And he says, for pleasure seeketh objects beautiful, melodious, fragrant, savory, soft, but curiosity for trial's sake, for the contrary as well, not for the sake of suffering annoyance, but out of lust of making trial and knowing them. For what pleasure hath it to see in a mangled carcass what will make you shudder? And yet, if it be lying near, they flock thither, to be made sad and to turn pale. Even in sleep, they are afraid to see it. From this disease of curiosity are all those strange sights exhibited in the theater. And I think it is this curiosity, which I want to, for the moment, just universalize, that is part of the fascination with the body and seeing the body in that moment between life and death. There is something, I think, powerful and important that lies between pleasure in theater on one hand and brutality and injustice on the other. And it may be that it's outside the emotional register altogether, but we don't get to choose how and when we die. And for most of us, the suffering that might attend our death is unimaginable and unknowable, and being witness to death is one way of bringing us closer to a knowledge that we long for and recoil from. And in this sense, I think these videos of death excite ocular desire and allow the viewer to access a kind of existential curiosity about pain and suffering and death. But I do also think that in order to see and read these videos in that way, in that sense of universalized curiosity or desire, is also to not see other things in the videos. That means screening out other narrative information about race and power. Okay, I have a little thing about audio, which I am gonna skip altogether. So let me just wrap up. Yes?
Can I ask how you conceive these categories between, as I remember you saying, murder is spectacle and lynching? Because so much of lynching is done in public places in front of crowds. And so how do you make that distinction between
The public execution and the
Yeah.
lynching? Why are they why am I
Yeah,
calling them two
why
different
do you-
genealogies?
Yes.
I'm calling them, so that's a really good question. They needn't be, you could tell a story, and again, this goes back to your very first question of like, how do you characterize the storyline, right? They could be one story, and the reason I was distinguishing them was because, at least initially, the public executions are done with state authority, right? They are legal killings. And the lynchings are extra legal killings. And one reason you could tell them as the same story, I think, is because you can say, by doing nothing about them, the state essentially condones and legalizes lynching, right? So that is the sense in which they're the same story. But part of, at least the Foucaultian story I'm trying to tell is about the legitimacy of power, and I think the lynchings complicate the legitimacy, at least. So that was the only distinction I'm making.
Somewhat related question, but with the consent of the condemned, shouldn't there be a First Amendment right to view executions?
There is, there's an interesting case. I think it's like, I don't know if you know this, Brian, it's like KQED versus something. There's a case about that exact issue. That is, I think it was a news station making a claim that they had a right to film an execution at San Quentin. And you don't.
It's a matter of positive law.
I want to say yes. I can imagine that argument being successful, but it's not.
I mean, it does seem to say something interesting, though, about the court's conception of visualizing death and state-sanctioned death. In a sense, it sets it in a category, arguably, of obscene in some sense.
Right.
The unfilmable or the unrepresentable.
Right. I think that's actually quite right. There's both a obscenity concern about it and honestly a political concern about it. And the modern death penalty has tried to distance itself a lot from public execution, making it what the courts have called, what the Supreme Court has called the mere extinguishment of life. And that's hard to portray the mere extinguishment of life is hard to portray visually, I think. But interestingly, these, state executions are still represented. They're just represented textually. They're not visually, or textually, not imagistically. Okay, so just summing up, how do these mediated spectacles do their work, and how do they induce both affective response and critical engagement? I think there is something, I have a piece about Walter Benjamin in here and the exhibition value of mechanical reproduction that he was so fascinated with. But there's something paradoxical about the videos in that they are both once extraordinarily graphic and banal. And as I ask people what their reactions have been, there is an inability to express the reaction to them, even when it is not one of intense emotional response. And I think it's partly animated by the fact that they have a little bit of psychoanalytic symptomatic quality to them. And one of the reasons I think Benjamin is interesting here is he says the camera introduces us to the unconscious optics, as does psychoanalysis to unconscious impulses. And there's something about these videos that feels quite symptomatic. But it is also the quality of these videos as spectacles and as symptoms, their ability to implicate the viewer in the response that has helped create a broader sense that the deaths of unarmed black men at the hands of police are not simply private injuries or aberrations, but broad and persistent injustices that reflect ongoing racial inequality. And this is their power more as cultural artifact than as legal fact. They have exposed how frighteningly thin that line can be between police as protectors and police as perpetrators, but only for some citizens. Whereas the death penalty must be carried out humanely to vividly establish a hierarchy between the law-abiding and the lawless. The extra legal police killings collapse that crucial distinction on which legal authority rests. And I'm going to stop there. So I'm happy to just keep answering questions, or actually I'd love comments, because this is such an initial foray into thinking about these. I would really, if you have suggestions about ways to reframe or what doesn't work, what makes sense, I'd love that too.
Is there a thought, and I guess the Boston bombings, what brings this home, that the truth then becomes the video, and you see the videos, and that is what happened. I mean, you don't imagine it in any other way, other than it's shown in the videos. You can't. I mean, whatever actually happened there, the video is the truth.
Right, and especially after it becomes legal fact, right? Legal fact kind of fixes it, and because it ends in judgment. And then the judgment establishes the image as truth. I think that's right.
What we're seeing in the Boston bombing in particular, when you see the video, it's, to some extent, it's a composite. It's not just a camera. It's a bunch of cameras, and so it's if you've taken all this stuff and created the truth out of it.
So this is actually true of a lot of these videos, that they're, the Tamir Rice video is different excerpts of, and the Crawford video is also, most of them actually are spliced bits from security cameras. There's probably 10 or 15 minutes that elapse where he's walking through Walmart. Yeah.
So is the Rodney King video, of course.
And right, exactly, and the Rodney King video where you splice it down into stills to tell a story, to re-narrate it effectively.
Well,
Yeah.
even more than that, because what was circulated was like a 2.5 minute excerpt of a 27-minute long video,
Right.
which is still not publicly available.
Right. Yeah. So I mean that's partly why I want to be clear that all of these are fragments, but it's more than, they're not just fragments. They are, even within the fragment, they're kind of fragmentary. You get different pieces being put together. Yeah.
So this is all totally fascinating. I spent a bunch of time with human rights people who were initially very excited about the prospect of using film for human rights advocacy campaigns. with good reason, right? We would watch videos. People would get very upset, or videos or stills of things like Abu Ghraib.
Right.
And all of a sudden there would be an uproar. And so the thought was, well, we can cause the uproar, right? But of course, you have to disentangle at least two questions. One is, what effect does the photo or video actually have on the social movement, if it has any, right? And then two, you have to actually see whether or not it will have that effect when you attempt to make it have that effect, right? Can these campaigns be controlled? If it would be interesting to know if any of the 6 videos that you put up had actually been deliberate attempts by someone who was opposed to police extrajudicial killings to get people really riled up. Because I could see it being a very powerful tool that someone like ACLU or Amnesty could take these videos and make a campaign around them. But I could also see that backfiring.
Right. I mean, right. And I think if there's, I don't know if you guys have seen the most recent viral video about racism by the redneck.
No.
So it's called something like Redneck Exposes Racism or something like that. It's actually a very powerful video. Yeah.
I have something you should see before you leave. Some years ago I gave Roberta Harding a blown up photograph I'd gotten from a lawyer. I had it blown up, and it's the last public hanging in Kentucky. And it's quite eerie because of the crowd and the spectacle. I thought it was interesting because of the late Paul Oberst, who was here as a professor for years when he was a young lawyer. The Bar Association sent him to witness this for some reason.
She's not there. We just knocked on the door then.
It's not there. Okay, yeah, I would love
It's
to.
quite a haunting photo, and
I think it's a very famous photograph, though.
Right. Is it online?
Yeah.
You should be able to find it.
Okay.
It's
I
pretty
think
famous.
we could get somebody to open the door and you could
So
see.
let me just finish my response to you, which is, so this video is, it's quite effective, right?
Yeah.
It's calling out white people for their privilege from the perspective of someone who we associate with racism. And but there's this backlash to it because the guy who made it is a Cuban actor, and so it has, and he made it as part of a campaign about racism, and it works, but precisely because it was not,
Authentic.
Right, there's this,
Right.
people feel like, wait, there's this element of pretense about it because it's an actor, right? It's
Yeah.
not an authentic redneck.
And it might only work on the people that already agree with those views. I mean, one problem with the human rights campaigns is that there are plenty of people who see those videos and they go yes, and they give an extra $5 when they were already giving $20 to Amnesty, but they don't necessarily have an effect. I mean, sometimes they will, but we don't know what the effect is on the people who otherwise wouldn't care about that issue.
We
Right?
have some sense in these videos because of these GoFundMe campaigns.
Yeah.
You know, Darren Wilson, who shot Mike Brown, received, I think, well over $500,000
Yeah.
in public donations.
Oh, it's more than that. Yeah.
It's more than that, I
Yeah.
think, but that was the last one I stopped paying
Yeah.
attention.
I mean,
So you have some sense now, like that is
yeah.
not
Right.
reliable, you know, it doesn't tell everything, but it gives you some sense of what people.
Right.
Yeah.
But these, I mean, it's a really interesting question because I think too orchestrated a campaign
Yeah.
invites backlash.
Right.
Or only speaks to those people who would already support it. I think partly this was the fact that these videos generated Black Lives Matter.
Yeah.
Black Lives Matter then had its own circulation,
Yeah.
and it changes the way white people watch the videos too. And I think
Yeah.
that has done something. Yeah.
How do you think about platforms like the Vine and Instagram? Because before, like I don't know how you do this, but I'm sure it's possible, but in the very early hours of that case, I know it's particularly with Mike Brown, but a little bit with Eric Garner as well, people were uploading these 10 to 30-second videos at the time. And you could see in the kind of fragmented way, but the platform itself forces a kind of splicing, right? And so you would get full conversations in like 10 seconds, but it couldn't be full because at some point you have to upload, right? But you would get multiple sort of pieces of conversations, and you would get multiple views of the bodies and what the police are doing, right? So it also, it's not just, it disrupts visually, but it also disrupts time in a kind of way. You know, so it makes time seem somewhat odd, and what can be, as Brian said, these very long periods of time can be collapsed in a kind of way very quickly.
That is so helpful. That's really interesting because I haven't thought about that, you know.
The Vine and Twitter
Right,
were huge, but the Vine just as much because people were linking their Vine accounts to Twitter.
Okay.
And so you would get
you're
these videos, right? And so
Right.
all throughout those initial weeks in Ferguson, you could follow like the state senators who were and city council people in their confrontations with the police. You could watch all on the Vine, and you could see it, but in a kind of fragmented way. So the initial images of the body I first saw on Twitter that was uploaded from the Vine, from somebody's Vine account. And African Americans, this question about the scopic regime, because African Americans are early adapters to Twitter and the Vine and Instagram. And so if you look at Twitter, African Americans are the largest demographic users of Twitter, mostly because it can be used through your cell phone, so you don't need computers in order to make it work. And the CEO of Twitter was one of the first celebrities to go to Ferguson because of the impact that Twitter was having. And so it's not these questions of how people see things and how technology is interfacing. It means that people are seeing it differently than someone who might go to The Guardian or their local news site,
Right.
where it might be mediated with the newscast,
Guardian,
the
exactly,
anchor person's intro to the video, rather than the sort of initial, sort of straight from the streets footage, if you will.
Yeah, no,
So-
that's super helpful. Actually, I have a student right now writing a paper about Black Twitter.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Precisely because as a,
Extremely powerful.
yeah, really, really helpful. Yeah.
I was just gonna say that also reminds me, well, it ties into the larger issue of how potentially Foucault's point about public and state sanctioned killings happen, because this doesn't seem to be state sanctioned, this is all
Yeah.
private,
Right,
right? We're using
exactly.
Twitter, we're using Instagram, so I'm just wondering how that would break
Well,
apart part of the.
it really complicates the private
Right.
public dichotomy at all. That is, it is. I mean, Twitter is kind of public-private,
Yeah.
Right.
right? It is its own virtual public square. Anyone can go there.
But then I guess that would complicate the Foucauldian point, because you don't even need the state anymore, in a way, right? Like,
Which, you know, I think the question of the role of the state is I didn't really go very far down that road. It's really complicated here, which is your question about like why is the public execution different than the lynching? Because these are, I mean, look, some of these have been in indictments, and the officers are being prosecuted for murder, and suddenly that changes. Basically, the state does a 180, but they're initially executed, not punningly intended, but executed on behalf of the state. And so I think that actually is an important distinction that I want to hold on to for the moment, but it's hard to hold on to.
but the state acting, right, there are two different ways that the state could be acting at least, right? Through the policeman's actions, but also through providing a space in which the public sees these actions,
Right.
right? Which I think are two very different
Yes.
points. And then again, sort of, if you're so interested in this timing, which I think is very much a part of these fragmented things, then like the loop back effect of determining maybe the illegality of these in a later proceeding, how does that impact the viewing of these activities, right? Because I think it's hard to sometimes unpack where the state is acting.
Right. Well, and, I mean, again, this is Foucault, the state acts multiply, and, you know, in contradictory administrative ways,
Right.
not just in these grand displays of
Right.
violence and power. But I think that's absolutely right. It very much complicates the reading of the image as well as the question initially of, is the state action?
Mhm.
What kind of state action
Mhm.
is it?
I've been thinking the whole way through this that at some point, relatively quickly, all of this probably morphs into another form of entertainment, where most people who watch this deep down inside really don't care. I mean, they say they do when they talk about it, but the most people who watch it are entertained by it, and it's another form of visual entertainment that we see all the time. We see shootings on TV and dramas, we see policemen shooting people. It's much more exciting, in fact, on TV than this. As you were saying, this is very banal. This makes death look sort of boring in a
I
way.
mean, in a sense, it was entertainment first.
Right.
Right?
I think
mean,
it's
it was-
right.
it
It's
was-
always been
But
entertainment.
no, but I mean, this thing that you're trying to single out as something new and interesting and exciting and special is actually going to become nothing more than entertainment very quickly. So that we right now think this is interesting because there's been so much of it and it's made a difference. But at some point it becomes background noise and it's just more TV and not terribly interesting TV. And if you look at the way that, and TV I'm using in a very broad
Right.
sense, visual entertainment, if you look at the sort of thing that's available on visual media these days, it ranges from extraordinarily primitive produced stuff to extremely sophisticated produced stuff. And this probably begins to feel as though it fits right in that, somewhere in that scale. This is just another visual image that I'm seeing along with hundreds of other visual images that I see, some of which have involved killing, some of which have involved blood or screaming or torture and police and armies and all these other things. I wonder whether anybody at the end of the day, other than people who are already predisposed to care, which was sort of the point that was being made a second ago, people who are predisposed to care may continue to care about it for a while. But most people watching this don't distinguish it that much from other entertainments that they see on TV. Your remark about the first-person shooter was interesting. So it was the first thing I thought of when I saw that policeman with his gun. It looks like a video game. And an awful lot of people who see this, kids who see it, young people who see it, they're not shocked. They're just watching it. They think it's fun.
Right.
Right?
I mean,
Which is a little scary, but it's nevertheless a reality, I think. I
Oh,
suspect.
absolutely, right. This is always already entertainment. That's what Ouija is sort of capturing in the 40s and 50s, and it was certainly true before that too. And I think it's one of the, I suspect, like I haven't done any reception analysis of how people are making, and people would mean a lot of different kinds of people and reactions too, but I haven't really assessed that, and my guess is that some of it is disappointment, right? Like, is this it?
Yes, I do.
Um,
It's like the Eichmann
Like the
problem.
like-
Surely this can't be the Holocaust.
it's the banality of
Yeah.
evil, right? Which is like, that's it. It's some pops, and,
It's like the Reagan
and it's like,
assassination attempt.
the production
You do these
value's
little
not very
poppy
good,
noises,
and,
Yeah.
and there's and so much of what we see is about law and legal violence, and illegal violence comes through primarily in entertainment form anyway. So I think it is really hard to sort out, that is certainly already part of the reception. And I just don't know, I haven't connected it up with specific kinds of reactions.
Because it does, it seems to me that if one is going to think about the larger cultural implications of these videos, that piece of the culture, the encompassing culture in certain respects, has to become part of the frame. Maybe it's not the entire frame, but it's certainly part of the frame. And none of us can see these things innocently anymore.
Right.
We see all of these things in a context of having seen it all before, and sometimes much worse. And we almost have to abstract ourselves from our normal images of murder on TV, if I can put it that way, to see this as something special and different, even though it seems boring and so forth and so on.
And it was interesting in the context of Justice Scalia's invocation of the French Connection or something.
Right.
You know, it's like we use visual metaphors to describe and frame evidence that we're seeing and to place in the context that makes sense.
Right.
The picturesque is so nice because it's almost as nice as a picture.
Right.
Right.
Right. No, that's absolutely right. And when I sort of skated through the context of viewing as part of how you would have to make sense of the image, but clearly the context of viewing is not just the situatedness of the viewer in the moment of viewing. And there that Instagram, you
How do you
know,
deal with the question of repetition?
what's that?
Repetition of viewing.
Right, well, that is another really, I mean, that is the other thing about it that's it's so accessible in a way that it increases the banality of it, right? It's like, just keep looking. And, but I think the context of viewing, if I were to expand on that, I would absolutely think about it as part of the larger way in which we understand images against the background of
The third and
mass
the fourth
entertainment.
paper out.
Right.
You know, I mean, I think in a way that the repetition can also make these kind of motion picture images really totemic as well.
Can make it
Like
what?
totemic, like the home movie, the Zapruder home movie.
Yeah, that's exactly the example.
The
I
Kennedy
think of.
assassination,
Right.
right? I mean, in an effort to extract epistemic information from that home movie that it arguably doesn't contain, right? So people are looking for answers
Right.
that can't be provided, but there's a sense in which there's this feeling or this desire to watch it as many times as possible in order to look
To
a little
find
bit
the
deeper, to
clues.
find that clue
Right.
that you can't quite locate,
Right.
right? And I think Errol Morris has written really well about this.
Right.
And films like Blow Up or
Right.
Blowout, I think, have sort of engaged with that same desire for epistemic satisfaction that a document might not be able to provide. And for me, that's like a big part of the tension between the epistemic value of these images and films as records of things that happened in the world and the narrative context in which they're placed, in which we expect them to tell a story and we construct a story around them
Right.
that they may not actually be able to substantiate in all
Right.
cases. You know, and I think that something like in many cases this comes up, and I think that was a tension in the Rodney King case. I actually see it as a tension in the Scott v. Harris case as well, and I see those as in some ways really deeply related. You know, I mean, police chases in which a black motorist is injured at the end of a police
Right.
chase, obviously playing out in very different contexts.
Right.
But I think the epistemic and narrative questions that both of those videotapes pose are actually interestingly similar.
Right.
And people read them and frame them and think about them epistemically differently based on the narrative that they want to tell about them.
The explosion of the Hindenburg would be another good example. The very few seconds of video that started a little late.
Right.
You watch this thing
But
collapse
I
into the
think
ground.
even when you don't, I think even when you don't already know how you want to make sense of it, that there is an impulse to narrativize, right?
Oh.
And that starts
Yeah.
the search for
Right.
clues.
Well, what I'm reminded of is, for example, the Society for Cinema Studies. There was this huge debate around the time of the Rodney King trial, and when the video was released, you know, as you probably remember, or at least aware retrospectively,
I was cognizant of the, I
Yeah.
was old enough.
there was, well, no, I mean, I was with the kind of the meme, as it were,
Right.
and the dominant sort of theoretical perspective in cinema studies at that time was highly relativistic, right? So the idea was that essentially meaning depends entirely on context. Images don't mean anything in and of themselves. They have no defined meaning, and it all depends on the perspective from which you look at them. And unsurprisingly, for many people, that kind of theoretical sort of understanding was inconsistent with their desire to narrativize this video and say, well, everything else is relative, but this isn't.
Right.
Right? This only means one thing, and if you don't see what I see, then you're seeing it wrong.
Right.
Right? And so there was a real kind of, and Bill Nichols wrote really interestingly about that tension. And
I don't, okay.
I have a bunch of stuff that you'll
Yeah, would
like.
you send it to
Yeah.
me?
Yeah, and I think as well, Noel Carroll's work on epistemology
Right.
and motion picture evidence would be really
It would be great.
helpful.
It would be great. I mean, I realize I am sort of treading into a very big literature that and that the film stuff I don't know as well. But it's clear, like, I completely agree with you that it's epistemic. And Peter Brooks has written in an interesting way about the case as a legal case, a therapeutic, psychoanalytic case, a detective novel case, all of these as the case as a set narrative that already presupposes a certain kind of plot line, and that requires the extraction of clues, right? That there's always the reveal, but it's the search for clues that generates the plot.
Right.
This is, I think, also why the question of time is just as important, because, you know, like every defense attorneys and prosecutors set up a timeline, right? So everybody, and one of the things I thought was interesting about Kathy's question on instant replay is that, I mean, part of the objection to replay is that you can slow the video down to points where you can see in more detail what's happening. And the question is it more important, the sort of accuracy of the slowed down image or the perception of the actors in real time?
Right.
And in these videos, you see the same thing. Like, this is one of the reasons why I'm not a huge proponent of body cameras, because I think it amplifies the experience of the person who's wearing the camera.
Right.
And so, and it speeds it up, and you get to hear their exasperated breath. It says nothing about whether they should be chasing anyone in the first place,
Right.
But you get a lot more about what's happening to them. And so, you know, lawyers are they're taught to create a narrative, and in criminal cases to have a timeline about the events. And like, this is a big part of what they will be doing in collaboration with police, is trying to set up and account for all of the moments that lead up to the death at hand.
Right.
And these videos, you know, because with Walter Scott, there's two different videos. There's dashboard cam, and then there's cell phone
Right.
video, and then there's time in between. So I'm interested to see when he goes to trial, those lawyers both are going to have a field day with the time in between.
Right.
You know, like what happens in this 10 seconds? I know
The time without the video.
the time
Right,
without the
right.
video.
Yeah.
It puts so much.
Yeah.
I mean, this is talk about epistemic pressure. It puts
Uh-huh.
so much pressure on the video.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
And the defense attorney is just going to be saying, look at the end. Like, this is all you need to see. But what happens up until then, like the timeline,
right.
you know?
Right. But the fact that you don't, the fact that you don't see the space in between suggests that what you do see when you see the image tells you what you need to know.
Or the opposite, right? I
Yeah.
think one of the
Or it
things is
does-
that the spaces that no longer have visual representation become much more meaningful.
But this
Like
is-
I thought
this
of that
is
in
17 minutes.
Right,
in
right.
the context where he showed like the woman who wasn't taken, like the picture of the woman who was in the electric chair and then a blank, like I just think that the negative spaces too become that much more meaningful. It's not clear that there's only one vector in terms of meaning. I think maybe
Yeah.
a lot of the discussion
And
will
I
come
think
in that
part of it is
empty.
that in this space where there is no video is where these sort of cultural and conflicts around justice really become so vibrant. You know, when you talk, people still have the opinions over time. I don't know about the studies. People have done studies of the O.J. Simpson trial more than Rodney King. But if you ask the same people questions 10 years out, 15 years out, their evaluation of all of the evidence that was so bandied about in popular culture, it changes. And so it'd be interesting to see in the long run what these questions of video mean. And there's no videotape of the shooting in the Mike Brown case, but there are snippets of video.
Right,
But we never get to see them because there is no trial, you know?
right, exactly.
That's really interesting too, that you only see them at, like, given the legality. I mean, that's another thing
Well, it
about.
depends on who takes, right, so
Who
if
takes it,
they're,
whether-
Yeah.
depends on who takes them, so sometimes they're just, if it's bystander, they're just uploaded and,
Or if it's taken by the police, which is now, wow, there's a big call among activists and African Americans in general, like it's now a big pitch for the cloud in the Black community to send your videos and pictures directly to the cloud. They give you little tutorials on how to set your phone up to automatically upload video that
Yeah.
you
They're out
take.
there, yeah.
I know, because my mother did it. She's like 72, and she did a tutorial on YouTube
wow.
about
Okay.
how to both capture images on your cell phone and how to send them to the cloud.
But that's also interesting because it reverses the state public sanction. I know
Yeah.
if the state is not actually releasing
Mhm.
information or videos, then it actually has the opposite effect of turning, at least in that circumstance, turning it into this like public spectacle. They're trying to clamp.
There is a little bit, I don't know if this would be helpful to you, but there's some writing about the, which might be interesting given your questions about technology, is that there is some writing about the CSI effect on juries. So
yeah.
CSI is totally like screwed prosecutors in a way that they had not imagined. Because now
That's
people's
hilarious.
desire for evidence is like technological evidence is so much higher. DNA helped them along, you know, because it
Right.
has this kind of certitude. And it's in the popular culture with you know, Maury Povich and whatnot. But
I'm resisting going down that road, but yeah.
but there is some writing about how jurors are just like, you have not presented us with sufficient information, and there may be some people who talk about videos, images, and that sense of technology and that work. I don't know.
I've been struck recently as well that I think that the CSI effect,
Yeah.
as it's often called by prosecutors, may be complemented or amplified by the people's growing familiarity, well, kind of long-standing familiarity with the unjustly accused film narrative, but more recently, the sort of unjustly accused documentary narrative. Because one thing that I found interesting is that certainly among documentary filmmakers, a sort of norm has emerged in which unless the person you're making the film about is innocent, there's no movie, right? So in the world of documentary filmmaking, there's no such thing as a person who's guilty.
What about the
of a crime.
Jinx?
What about War
Well,
Don Don?
I mean, that's War Don Don was, I think, one of the reasons it struggled so much is because
yeah.
people. It was a great movie, and I think very complicated movie.
Wait,
But you should
But-
say one of the he was convicted for what?
He was legitimately convicted of horrible war crimes
In the
and being
Sierra
responsible
Leone.
for I mean awful things. The point of the movie was essentially, is this guy just a scapegoat?
Can he be held
for-
responsible for
for-
crimes that were much
for
more than
greater
just one
injustice,
individual?
Many
yeah.
people are culpable. He's only one person who's culpable,
Yeah.
which is, I think, is a really important, interesting
Right.
question, but also one audiences don't want to hear about.
Right.
Right? And I think that, for example, explains a lot of the fascination of something like Serial as
Right.
well,
Right.
right? Where people become invested in the narrative and they need for this person to be innocent in order for them to feel narrative closure. Because if he's guilty, this is really unsatisfying.
Right.
But I also think
you know?
This is the way I
Problem
think
with
race
serial killer.
intervenes in that narrative, is that for many people, they need for that person to be guilty, right? So even with Tamir Rice, I think can be a little more complicated, but John Crawford was holding a gun that was sold in Walmart.
Right.
Like he was in the store shopping
Right.
in a place where you could pick up guns and carry them around.
Right.
Yet there is a way that the counter narrative is that he is somehow culpable.
Right. So that's the right,
And so race continues to intervene, and so there's no desire for innocence here, but always a question of how can we make them guilty?
how can we justify the fact that they were in fact threatening?
Even
right?
when you look at like the transcripts, the grand jury transcripts of Darren Wilson, he and Mike Brown are the same size.
Yeah, exactly.
The exact same size, and he talks about him as this like monster who was bigger than life, who
Right, well,
you
this
know,
is
and there's
the-
a way that these racial narratives intervene in a way they come with the image
Right.
so the execution of the guilty can always be legitimated by the state.
Absolutely,
But would
right?
that change there were a video showing both of their sizes? Right, like that's.
No, because
No,
the.
it doesn't
Right.
change
It doesn't
psychologically.
change
Right.
because the image of a black man comes pre-encoded as threatening, right?
Mhm.
So if it's a black man holding a gun, you have, like, you don't ask questions, which is why, like, somehow there's no conversation that
No.
happens
In
But
John
how does that
Crawford's
in
make-
Crawford or Rice.
Mhm.
But then how do you see film or the visual interfering? If these narratives are already preset, what
Because I think one of the
is yeah.
because I actually do think that it's, in some sense, this is the repetition of them. It both banal, but it actually reinforces. Black Lives Matter is trying to alter that narrative, and it changes the way the videos are perceived, so that I think more people are willing to read them as not already justifiable.
Mhm.
That's the point that I'm most hopeful about. Like, I don't know that that's,
But I think that presents the same kind of issue that's at stake in the video in Scott v. Harris, right? Which is there's this distinction between the relevant factual information that a video can provide with respect to contested legal questions of culpability
right.
and the narrative context in which people perceive that videotape. And I think for me, that's kind of my objection to Kahan's work, is I feel like they blur that distinction in a way that makes their conclusions less credible or
They
less
blur the distinction between
narrative and epistemology.
okay.
You know,
Yeah.
I've written about this a little bit in terms of, I mean, one of the distinctions in your categories is that lynching victims are always innocent in the
Right.
narratives
Right.
of lynching, right?
Right.
From the perspective of even now, when we talk about it in a sort of larger cultural way, that there's a way that they are the sort of subject of, that they are innocent.
Right.
Innocent people who have been killed by the extra-legal mob. And I think that may be a distinction between, a sort of important distinction between these two, because Peter Brooks writes about this in some ways, about how do we think about remorse and confession and all of these
Right.
things in those images, so.
Yeah, well, I'm trying to, I mean, I actually want to say this is also the distinction between the public execution
Yeah.
too, which is like, we're talking about innocent victims.
Yeah.
We're not talking about a condemned person who's gone through trial and been adjudicated to be
And
guilty.
Herrera versus Collins is clear about this case, where it's the actual innocence case, where the I think it's Scalia says, look, actual innocence does not overwhelm legal guilt. And if you have been found legally guilty in a full and fair proceeding, then your actual innocence
Is beside the
irrelevant.
point.
it's
Well,
not really
Procedural is
Well,
dividend.
Yeah,
Yeah.
But to be fair, he's not saying that they should. I mean,
Well, he's saying they should not be allowed to enter into federal habeas, which
Right,
expedites
right,
these
right,
people
that,
back to
that the court
execution.
doesn't have the power to do
Yeah.
anything, but presumably that the executive should. Now, whether they will or not is always another question entirely.
But he does ultimately rely on procedure
Yes.
Yeah.
to determine
Right.
guilt or innocence,
Right.
which actually would weirdly be very supportive of this whole thing, where there's been no procedure.
Right, I mean, that's the whole point is,
Yeah.
it almost, they're de facto innocent because there is absolutely no procedure. And in that sense, it looks more like a
But
lynching.
lynching activists are writing about this very point, the
Yeah,
question of
exactly.
procedure, right? And so they're writing about this question of whether or not, they said, look, whether or not they should be executed is sort of beside the point in this way, because there's no, what does justice mean? Where's
Right.
the Constitution
Right.
in these events? But one of the things you mentioned about Black Lives Matter that I think is really interesting in comparison to the ways we think about the framing of people who have been subject to injustice, is that there's a real effort to say it doesn't matter whether or not these people are innocent.
Right.
And so there's a real attack, and people literally use the words politics of respectability, attack on the
Right.
politics of respectability
Right.
that pervades earlier generations. To say, look, we don't care, we don't, whatever they did 10 minutes before, in this moment, this was an unjust
Right.
state execution, which is very different than it would have been in their parents' generation.
Right.
So-
Right. That's absolutely right, and partly why I don't want to push too hard on the guilt and innocence is
Yeah.
precisely for that reason. It's not, it doesn't change
No.
the point I want to make and the point that I feel like the thing that makes these videos interesting as something other than just legal bits of information.
Yeah. I think there's some audience work as well. You know, there's a whole sort of world of black television on the internet. And so young people in general are moving towards sort of selective viewing through the computer. But African Americans are really sort of.
Do you know of any reception
I
studies?
can ask. We have in our writing, rhetoric, and digital studies department, there's someone who does
Nice.
some work on that, yeah, who I could ask for some references.
Would you?
Yeah.
That would be great. Yeah, that would be great.
Does anything turn on whether or not like differently structured videos, like Melinda's prior point of, you know, you don't want cameras maybe on the bodies of policemen, but you may want maybe surveillance camera footage. Like I wonder if anything turns on the distinction.
Legally speaking, courts have spoken to these questions much more substantively in different contexts. So the editing and, I mean, from an epistemic standpoint, the editing and perspective questions come up much more frequently in the context of what they call malingering videos, primarily. Malingering. This is actually one of the earliest kind of genres of motion picture evidence. So they were, what happened is a photographer photographer with a movie camera would hide and film a tort plaintiff in order to establish that they weren't injured in ways that they claimed to be injured, and then try to introduce
This
those.
is the Brady Bunch.
Yeah, sure. I mean,
Or Dateline NBC.
Yeah. And then on the other side, and so there were questions there about, you know, whether it was representative and the timing and the perspective and so on and so forth. But you know, they established sort of a rubric for admission, admissibility or non-admissibility, and then tort plaintiffs gradually developed kind of a complementary genre, as it were, called day in the life movies, where they would create kind of mini documentaries.
Those I've heard of. I do know about malingering. It's such a
and the tension over the day in the life movies was over, you know, the construction of them in some sense, and you know,
That makes a lot more sense.
were they representative,
Like,
and how does the editing
There's a lot of discussion
that's like
about this
film
from
victim impact
Yeah,
statements.
that's about to say.
Right.
Exactly.
Yes, but no, because the difference is, and this is something, victim impact statements, at least in my reading of them, are kind of sui generis, because they're not actually entered, I don't think, for their epistemic value so much as for their emotional value, right? They don't have to prove anything. And so, I mean, in a sense, other than...
Well, they impact sentencing.
Right. I mean,
Right. They impact sentencing, but they're not
But
subject to the same rules of evidence, right? And the way that...
They're meant to be more.
Right, and so for me, the tension there is much stranger, because something that I think is legitimately inadmissible in the context of a day in the life movie, where you're trying to use something to manipulate the jury's or fact finders' reading of the epistemic content of what you're presenting to them, is not the same in a victim impact video, where the purpose of a victim impact video is to speak to the emotional sort of investment and emotional sort of logic, as it were, of the fact finder as to the appropriate punishment to impose on the accused. But you're no longer going to questions of factual guilt or innocence, or, you know, factual liability or non-liability. You're going to questions of, you know, what are the kind of moral values I mean, frankly, from my perspective, I question whether that's a legitimate form of information to be providing in the first place. But you know, that's a whole nother issue. I mean, from a formal standpoint, it seems to me that the questions you ask about information or documents introduced in this two different phases would be functionally different, because they're intended to do very different
I see what you're saying.
things.
Right, I see what you're saying.
But they're also very different from the videos of a spontaneous surveillance.
Yes, yes,
Right.
yes,
Would raise
because
different
they're
questions in terms
constructed.
To go back to your point, there is one, I mean, there must be more at this point, but there is at least one sociological study that's been done of filmed confessions, where they
Oh.
change the camera angle at which the viewer sees the confession. So in some of them, the camera's behind the interrogator and you're looking at the accused or the defendant. The other, it's flipped, and then there's one where you see both of them. And the findings suggest that you're more likely to think that the defendant is guilty if you're viewing them from the perspective of the interrogator, and much less likely if you're viewing the interrogator from the perspective
But
of
they're
the defendant.
confession videos, so they're actually,
They're what?
they're confessions,
Yeah,
you're saying?
they're all
So-
confession videos.
And I wonder if it impacts the believability of the confession itself.
Yes, right. So I think what they're doing is asking, when does the confession feel coerced, I should say, right? So it's not guilt or innocence, it's
Okay.
coercion of the confession.
I'm assuming that they're not all the same confessions then, right? If they have them from three different perspectives, there's no way that the cops are filming the same confession.
I
from
don't-
different
I-
cameras.
Is it an experiment or is it?
I think it's an experiment
Yeah.
though,
That
so
would
I
be
think they
actors.
actually
Yeah.
have the same confession filmed,
But then
shot
it's not,
from,
but then it's not, is it a real confession or an actor?
I think
It
it's
could be an
probably-
actor reading
Yeah.
a film, reading.
You know what, I don't know how they set up the experiment, that's
That's
really
interesting, because that would actually impact, no,
Yeah,
I
well,
think
no,
you're right.
Perhaps this
right.
reflects my skepticism of a lot of social science.
Right,
But
I know,
mean, you
it's
do you
like,
have-
I
do you have
think
a-
it lends
do you have-
more-
do you have a paper if you find no difference, is my question, right? So,
right, the desire to differentiate, but
well, or to run the experiment again until you get something other than a null result, you know?
You do have a paper if you find no difference.
Well, I mean,
There's no
Yeah.
difference, which is also significant.
yeah, although my impression is that in social science journals, it's pretty hard to print a null result, right? I mean, if you show that this doesn't affect anything, that's not generally seen as a very,
Well, this is not
Sexy.
hard if it goes against the grain of current things.
Exactly,
Right.
yeah.
right.
So, I'm
Have
a
you
social scientist, I take issue with
have
that.
you read anything, I don't know if it's
tell me
out
your
yet,
name,
but Albertina.
Albertina, you're
Yeah.
Melinda?
Ingrid Eastley, I think is her name. Eastley. She's at UCLA and she does immigration work mostly, but she actually has a piece coming out which I remember workshopping like 2 years ago, so it must be
How do you spell her last name?
Easley. Do you know Ingrid? That's how you spell
That's
it?
how you spell it. I don't know her, but I know her name. That's
It's
how
like,
you
I think
spell
that's how you
it.
spell it. She was doing something on the visual impact of having immigration court run through a video. So instead of actually
I
being
saw her
present-
talk
Oh,
at
you did?
Cincinnati, yeah, it was a
Okay.
good talk,
Yeah,
it was a good talk.
she's great. I don't know. I
Okay.
know
Which
her
happens
prior work.
in it happens in our jurisdiction, our immigration judges in Memphis.
Exactly. Yeah.
This
So
is
she
interesting in
did.
Texas, it's like,
Oh,
Yeah.
oh, yeah.
So she was
Oh.
doing an empirical study of the impact of the visual. You know, the effect of visual. She was asking
Yeah.
similar questions about what does the role of video and not being actually physically present have
yeah.
on
Oh,
these.
so it's not, it's the
It's the
video.
hearing. It's live.
The
The
hearings
hearing is
are
not live.
virtual.
Well, it is, but
It's
it is
live.
It's
virtual.
live.
It's live virtual.
so
I
the
think
judge
you're more
is somewhere.
interested in after the fact viewing, right? Is that true? Are you?
Am I
Yes,
or she?
You. No.
Oh.
She's doing live feed.
I am, yeah, I'm sort of after the fact meaning and interpretation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm really in love with British cop shows where there seems to be a camera everywhere. And I wonder if there must
In
if
England,
someone,
they are everywhere.
they are. I know, which are
Yeah.
everywhere.
That's so
And
funny.
I'm
just
like
do
doing.
that.
I'm doing my own personal research into what are the rules for searching a seizure there, because I'm just like that just seems wrong.
Yeah.
But it might be
Everywhere.
there might be someone who's written about this
Yeah.
question of ocular desire, given the prevalence of video and videotape footage and police access to that kind of footage.
Yeah.
Yeah, the saturation.
And
It seems.
yeah,
I don't know.
no,
I've never
and the
spent much time
UK actually a lot of interesting work about in-line humanities and visuality
Yeah.
is in the UK too. So
Yeah, it is.
I bet there is.
Someone has written a great, when I was viewing this picture, a great about collective memory and community, about balconies in Montreal, and about what the balcony means and the view from the balcony. And I can't remember the name of the book, but if it comes to me, I'll try and, I have it on my computer somewhere. I have this list of bibliography of collective memory, but a lot of it all
Do you know
started.
Norm Spalding's work
Mm-mm.
on collective memory?
Yeah, I worked with him really closely. Yeah, he was
Is
at
that right?
Stanford. Yeah.
He's such a good friend.
Oh, that's so
But it was
funny.
all about balconies, and I was like, and I read that a couple years ago. Now every time I see anything from a balcony, I'm just like, oh.
That's so funny, balcony.
The-
The flaneurs of like, yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm kind of interested in the collective memory stuff too.
Yeah.
And haven't.
I have a really long bibliography if you would like it. So I sent like a query to the Ford Fellows list.
I would love it because
And I
I
was like, can you help me find it? And it's like 8 pages long or something.
I would love it. Yeah,
So-
that would be great. I'm teaching this seminar on nationalism and cultural identity, and it changes all the time, but
Yeah.
there's usually something about.
Oh, there's some great
collective
things
memory.
in there. Yeah,
Yeah.
some great pieces in there.
Yeah, that would be. I
And a
would
lot
love
of
that.
stuff about museums, which I also find fascinating.
Yeah.
So.
Isn't that like Norm? Doesn't Norm have a piece on like the way that you conceive of a monument? The
Yeah,
monument.
Sanford Levinson has written about this.
Yeah,
too.
Sanford. I've
Inverted
given the
pyramid,
students Sanford
yeah.
Levinson. He has a piece. So he has a piece about the Constitution as collective memory, I think. But then he also has this thing about the Holocaust Museum.
Yes.
Yeah.
Is that?
Yes, that's what I'm thinking
Yeah.
of. It's an essay, I think. It's not a full article.
Right.
He talks about like the absence of space. Like I think there's something about it where there's an open space and how the absence of space is somehow more of a remembrance than actually having
That's
a physical
right.
representation of it.
Right.
Which is actually interesting again to contrast like how does lack of an image
Right.
sort of have more
What does
of a
negative
less-
space
yeah,
do?
Yeah.
No,
And so
that's
this whole
right.
thing was negative space, I think.
Yeah. There's also a trend in Holocaust museums as you advance to make them smaller and smaller, the space smaller, because it gives you the impression of closing in.
So I just saw an amazing, what's his name? The dissident artist, Chinese dissident artist.
Wait, what?
Ai Weiwei.
I
Ai Weiwei. Saw his show at Alcatraz, and having the show in the sort of not the more decayed parts of the prison. One is just an industrial building, and one is the old hospital wing. So cool. Think about portable museums of turning Alcatraz.
Yeah.
I mean, it already is kind of a museum, given that it's not in use anymore, but having an art exhibit and a very political art exhibit in the prison made it a really different space. It was just to walk through the hospital wing and have there's a whole audio portion of this exhibit too.
What was the exhibit on?
It was on, so one part of it was about political dissidents, and he had made Lego portraits of all these political dissidents, and they were all the way down on the floor, all the way down this building, and they, they're abstract from far, and then so that was about political dissidents. The hospital, the part in the hospital was really, it was a little bit more about madness and penality.